Beneath a busy stretch of Midwest highway, that feeling takes a living form. Below the roaring current of headlights and engines, a storm drain yawns like a hidden world, its mouth rimmed with rust and wet leaves. The cold November air smells of rain-soaked asphalt and distant wood smoke from farmhouses scattered along the back roads. Water trickles through the concrete throat of the drain, carrying scraps of last season's leaves and the occasional candy wrapper tossed from a passing truck. Inside that tunnel of dim echoes, a pair of amber eyes blinks open. The Bobcat lifts his head slowly, the tufts of his ears twitching at the low vibration of a semi-thundering above. He doesn't move otherwise. His fur, once thick with autumn health, now clings closer to his frame. He has become a creature of stillness, a ghost in a man-made cave. And like anyone who's spent too long in the shadows, he has learned the art of waiting. The world above barely knows he exists. Commuters speed past twice a day, thinking of grocery lists and work deadlines, while his life is measured in the drip of runoff water and the scent of small prey that sometimes strays too close to his refuge. On quiet nights, he can smell rabbits in the brush beyond the road. His muscles twitch with the memory of the chase, but the highway between him and the wild feels like an uncrossable river of light and metal. The air here is thick with contradictions. It smells of damp leaves and motor oil, of nature and intrusion. The echo of water drops becomes its own music, sometimes joined by the muted hum of tires overhead. Light filters through the grate in fractured beams, shifting with passing cars like the blink of a restless sky. This hidden world is his home, his prison, and his secret stage, all at once. There is a dignity to his suffering, the kind that speaks in silence rather than in noise. He does not cry out for help. He does not wail or claw for attention. He waits, as wild things do, with a patience born of necessity. The world would call him a predator, but tonight he is simply a survivor with a ribcage that rises and falls against cold stone. And in this quiet corner of the world, where the human eye rarely lingers, a story is beginning. A story about what it means to truly see and be seen. About how life can change the moment one lonely soul recognizes another in the shadows. About a bond that will ask for no words, make no demands, yet leave a mark as lasting as claw-scratched stone. If you've ever felt invisible and longed for someone to notice, subscribe now to join others who believe every life deserves to be seen. Tell me in the comments, has an animal ever reminded you that you matter? Dawn comes slowly to the underbelly of the highway. The first rays of sunlight catch in the damp edges of the storm drain, turning rivulets of water into silver threads that snake past bits of decaying leaves and a plastic soda cap. Above, the world awakens in a blur of engines, tires on wet pavement, and the distant caw of a crow riding the chilled air. But here, below the rush, it is another world, still, patient, and indifferent to human schedules. Ash, the Bobcat, stretches from his crouched position in the deepest corner of the tunnel. His movements are deliberate, like a coiled spring unfurling, every muscle taut but controlled. A puff of white breath escapes into the cold air. He blinks at the fractured light filtering through the grated openings, his amber eyes catching the brief reflection of passing headlights. To anyone above, he is just a flicker, if they notice him at all. The storm drain carries the smells of a season in transition. Wet soil and decomposing leaves mix with the faint sting of road salt and gasoline. Ash can taste the world through the air itself, the scent of a mouse having passed hours ago, the sharp tang of rubber from a tire that hit the grate in the night. He listens more than he moves. The distant hum of the highway is constant, a predator of its own kind, loud, fast, unpredictable. For now, the world feels safe in its familiarity. No footsteps, no sudden clangs of metal, just the measured drip of water hitting a shallow puddle and the occasional rustle of wind-driven leaves that tumble through the slotted openings above. Ash settles into his patient surveillance, tail curled neatly around his paws. He is a creature designed for silence. Bobcats rarely vocalize except in mating season. Their survival depends on being invisible until the moment of necessity. Outside the tunnel, the landscape hints at the retreat of autumn. Bare-branched sycamores stand in skeletal rows, their few remaining leaves clinging like reluctant memories. Beyond them, fields lie harvested and brown, stubbled with the remnants of corn stalks. A thin frost glistens across the roadside grass, fading where the sun has managed to reach. This is the season when food grows scarce and wild animals must push the boundaries of their range. Ash has learned to navigate this human edge carefully. He ventures only in the hours of dim light, dusk, dawn, and sometimes the muted glow of a cloudy night. When he emerges, it is with the precision of a shadow sliding along the ground. He knows the narrow game trails that lead to thickets of briars, the abandoned drainage ditch where rabbits hide, and the one fence line where voles scurry between roots. In his world, a single successful hunt is a day of life secured. Today, the bobcat waits. Hunger gnaws, but patience is his oldest companion. He licks one paw methodically, the rasp of his tongue against fur the only sound in his corner of the tunnel. He has survived storms and near misses with passing vehicles, and he will survive this day too. He has to. The air shifts slightly as a truck rumbles overhead, sending a faint vibration down into the concrete. Ash freezes, ears flicking, every sense attuned to danger. He waits until the tremor passes, until silence swells back into the space like a tide returning. In these pauses, the storm drain feels like a cathedral of solitude, each echo a soft hymn to survival. In this quiet morning, the bobcat's existence is undisturbed, his world reduced to survival and the small comforts of routine. It is a life measured in heartbeats and shadows, in the unspoken contract between predator and world. Stay unseen, stay alive. Soon, though, this fragile solitude will be interrupted, not by threat, but by an unexpected act of recognition. The life above and the life below are about to collide, and neither will remain the same. Ash lay in the dim curve of the storm drain, the damp concrete cool beneath his belly, his ears swiveling toward every sound that traveled through the long, hollow tunnel. He had chosen this place carefully, as wild creatures always do, not for comfort, but for survival. A storm drain is no den of soft earth or hollow tree. It smells of metal and oil, and the water that runs through it tastes faintly of rust. But it is a fortress, invisible to the predators he fears most. The roaring metal beasts that fly across the gray ribbon of road above, and the unpredictable two-legged creatures who sometimes slow just enough to harm without meaning to. He is 3 winters old, lean and sharp with the kind of muscle built from hunger and long pursuit. His fur is a mottled tapestry of tawny brown and dusky spots that blend with the dead leaves scattered around the drain's mouth. Tufts crown his ears like tiny banners of vigilance. His whiskers twitch when the wind changes. Each movement is purposeful, each pause deliberate. Ash's life is not loud. Bobcats are solitary by nature, walking alone along invisible paths marked by scent and memory. His world is built on a quiet conversation with the land, the press of soft soil under his paws, the whisper of grass against his legs, the faint metallic tang of frost on a November morning. Every night he slips from shadow to shadow, his paws nearly soundless against the wet concrete, scanning for the twitch of a rabbit's ear or the darting shape of a vole. He remembers in the way wild animals remember, not in pictures or words, but in pulses of sensation, his first real hunt as a yearling. The rabbit had bolted from a thicket just before dawn, and his body had moved on instinct alone, muscles coiling, breath tightening, claws slicing the air in one precise leap. The thrill of that chase lives somewhere deep in him still, even as hunger now presses against his ribs and his paw throbs from a cut earned on a shard of bottle glass. Pain does not make him whimper. It only deepens his stillness. The storm drain, for all its unnatural edges, has become his sanctuary. Its darkness protects him from the gaze of hawks and coyotes. Its echoes tell him who approaches. The water trickling past his paws carries the sense of distant things. Wet earth from the fields, gasoline from the trucks, and the faint electrifying smell of prey. He waits for the world to offer him an opening. There is a quiet wisdom in Ash's patience, the kind of knowing that comes from living close to the bone. He does not waste energy on fear or hope. He exists in the narrow space between them, where instinct and endurance meet. If he could speak, he would not beg for help. He would only say, "I am here. I will endure." Occasionally, a shadow breaks across the grated openings above, tires, boots, or the flutter of a crow's wings. He watches and listens, his amber eyes reflecting slivers of light. He knows humans move above him, but he does not yet link them to comfort or danger. They are simply part of the sky that rumbles and smells of fire. He has learned to let their world pass without entering his own, and yet something stirs in him, a subtle shift in the air, an unspoken awareness that his solitude is not infinite. He licks his paw slowly, methodically, while keeping one eye on the light above. The world has grown cold, and the prey more scarce. Survival pushes him closer to the edges of risk. In the stillness of the storm drain, Ash waits with a dignity that feels almost human, as if he knows that being seen is both peril and salvation. Soon the shadow moving above will slow instead of vanish. Soon eyes will meet across the divide of steel and stone, and two solitary lives will take notice of each other. But for now, the Bobcat remains a quiet king in his concrete throne room, listening to the heartbeat of the world through the hum of the highway. Cold rain slicked the mouth of the storm drain, turning the trickling runoff into a thin stream that licked at Ash's paws. He had endured hunger before, but the dull ache in his belly now had an edge that made his movements sharper and his patience thinner. For 3 nights he had gone without a proper meal. A single vole the evening before had given him only enough strength to endure the next sunrise. The cut on his paw burned when he shifted his weight. It was a deep slice along the pad, earned from a shard of broken glass washed into the drain after the last storm. He had stepped on it mid-pounce, chasing a field mouse that darted between the roots just beyond the concrete mouth. Instinct had made him leap anyway, and though he landed the kill, he left a trail of faint blood that the rain soon washed away. Bobcats are built for survival, but not invincibility. Their soft paw pads are sensitive tools, letting them move silently through underbrush and over stone. A cut like this meant every step carried a whisper of pain, and every hunt risked failure. He licked the wound when the world was quiet, the rasp of his tongue keeping it clean in the only way he knew. Ash's world had shrunk to the rhythm of survival. Wait, listen, move, endure. The storm drain, once a fortress, had become a cage. Hunger pressed him to leave, but the highway outside was a river of roaring death. He had tried to cross once before, months ago. The wind from a passing truck had slammed against him with the force of an invisible predator, sending him retreating to the safety of the dark. He had learned this river of metal was not meant to be crossed lightly. Now he waited in the shadows, ears flicking at every shift of sound. He could smell the faint warmth of a rabbit beyond the thicket across the road. His stomach tightened, his body telling him that risk and necessity were becoming the same thing. He lowered his head and pressed his cheek against the damp concrete, letting the vibrations of the highway move through his bones. He knew the language of the ground, the deep tremor of a semi, the lighter thrum of a pickup, the occasional sharp staccato of a motorcycle. He listened, calculating whether the world above would grant him a gap wide enough to run for his life. There was dignity in his stillness. Nature does not weep for him. Survival is a quiet affair. The rain continued to fall, pattering softly into the shallow puddles around his paws. Each drop seemed to mark time, a reminder that the season was turning. November's chill crept deeper into the concrete each night, and the warmth of summer rabbits was a memory fading into hunger. Yet, even in this quiet suffering, the thread of hope had not broken. Wild animals survive on the gamble that tomorrow will bring opportunity. His amber eyes, dulled by fatigue, still held a spark of calculation, a flicker of persistence that refused to surrender to the darkness of the tunnel. He had made it through storms and scarcity before. He would make it again if the world gave him the smallest chance. The storm drain amplified every sound of the highway, and in that echoing chamber, Ash's life felt both fragile and defiant. He shifted his weight once more, wincing as his paw met the wet concrete, and lifted his head toward the narrow grate. A single shaft of late afternoon sun cut through the bars, glinting on his fur. For a heartbeat, it felt like a spotlight in the theater of his hidden life, a life no one had yet paused to notice. Far above, the human world roared on, oblivious. But soon, the line between those worlds would blur. Soon, someone would slow, and the quiet suffering of the storm drain would no longer be invisible. Caleb Mercer drove the familiar stretch of Highway 41 with the kind of absent attention that comes from years of repetition. His hands rested lightly on the wheel of his old Ford pickup, the heater rattling against the early evening chill. The dashboard smelled faintly of oil and coffee, the ghosts of long shifts at the auto shop clinging to the upholstery. Outside, November rain misted the windshield, smearing the neon reflections of passing trucks into streaks of color against the darkening sky. For 3 years now, the drive home had felt like a corridor he walked in his sleep. He left the shop at sundown, followed the 2-lane ribbon past the harvested fields and skeletal tree lines, and arrived at a house that still smelled faintly of her perfume. Lydia's photograph sat on the kitchen counter where he left it, her smiling face a frozen memory of warmth he couldn't quite bring himself to pack away. Grief had settled over him like the fog that sometimes rolled in from the river, thick, silent, and stubborn. Caleb had learned to keep his life small. He fixed cars, microwaved dinner, and fell asleep to the low murmur of the radio. He didn't fish anymore, though the tackle box still sat in the garage. He didn't take his camera into the woods like he and Lydia used to, hunting for fox tracks and deer silhouettes at dawn. The wild had once been his second language, a quiet joy he shared with her. Now, it was just another thing he'd set down when she was gone. The rain picked up, a soft drumming on the roof of the truck, and Caleb leaned forward slightly, watching the water ribbon across the windshield. That's when a flicker of movement caught his eye, low near the base of the highway, where the runoff sloped toward the old concrete storm drains. He might have ignored it on any other night, but something in that glint of amber light snagged at him. He slowed, tires crunching over the wet shoulder, and peered through the blur of rain. 2 eyes, faintly luminous in the dying light, stared back from the darkness of the drain. Caleb's heart kicked against his ribs. He knew those eyes. Not this animal, but the look itself, the wild, solitary stillness that holds equal parts fear and defiance. He'd seen it once in a fox they'd photographed years ago, crouched beneath a log after a spring flood. And he'd felt it himself in the weeks after Lydia's funeral, when the world seemed to move above and around him, unaware that he was still here, still breathing. He eased the truck to a full stop and sat for a moment, the wipers squeaking rhythmically. Instinct told him to get out, to step closer. But another voice, quieter, older, reminded him that wild animals don't ask for rescue the way people imagine. They endure unseen until they cannot. Interfering without thought could do more harm than good. A pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, and he reluctantly pressed the gas, rolling back onto the highway. But his mind stayed behind, in the echoing tunnel where those eyes had glimmered. By the time he reached his driveway, he'd already decided he would come back, not as a savior, not yet, but as a witness. Inside the house, he kicked off his boots and stood for a moment in the kitchen, listening to the rain against the windows. He imagined the animal huddled in the damp cold of the drain, surviving in silence while the world sped past. Something in that image dug into the hollow space grief had carved in him. He pulled out his old thermos, filled it with hot coffee, and sat at the table in the low glow of a single lamp. In that quiet, he realized why the eyes had haunted him. They carried the same lonely weight he had been carrying, himself. And maybe, for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of purpose, small and tentative, but undeniable. Tomorrow he would drive that road again, and this time he wouldn't just pass by. The next evening, Caleb drove slower than usual along the rain-darkened stretch of Highway 41. His wipers squeaked in uneven intervals, brushing away the thin drizzle that had returned like an echo of the previous night. He scanned the ditches and storm drains as he went, the muted beams of his headlights sweeping across the wet slope of the embankment. He didn't know what he expected. Wild animals move on. They don't wait for people. But some part of him hoped the glimmering eyes would be there again, anchoring him to the thought that maybe he hadn't imagined them. He eased his truck onto the shoulder where he'd seen the movement before. A slow exhale left his chest as he put the gear in park and listened. The highway hummed with the distant rush of passing cars, the occasional roar of an 18-wheeler sending a faint tremor into the steering column. Outside, the cold had teeth, carrying the smell of damp earth and wet leaves. When he stepped out, the crunch of gravel under his boots sounded unnaturally loud. Caleb paused, letting the night absorb him. He thought of Lydia and the times they'd crept through the woods before sunrise, her hand lightly gripping his sleeve whenever she spotted something first. Patience, she'd always said, is the bridge to trust. He approached the storm drain slowly, crouching near the slick edge without leaning in. The smell of wet concrete and faint motor oil rose from the dark hollow. For a moment, all he saw was blackness, the kind of empty that swallows light whole. Then, just as his breath fogged in the cold air, the eyes appeared. Amber, steady, watching. The Bobcat's body remained hidden in shadow, only his gaze visible in the beam of Caleb's flashlight. His ears flicked once, betraying tension, but he didn't retreat. Caleb's heart lifted with cautious hope. He didn't speak, not at first. Words felt too clumsy for the gravity of the moment. He simply knelt, letting the drizzle bead on his jacket, and placed a small scrap of cooked chicken, last night's dinner, at the edge of the slope. He withdrew his hand slowly, as if every movement might break an unspoken agreement. Ash watched, still as a sculpture carved by instinct and hunger. His nose twitched, catching the scent. The wind carried it down into the drain, curling around the wild pulse of his hesitation. Hunger gnawed at him, but so did the memory of betrayal carved into his instincts. Human smells often meant danger. He flicked his tail once, a subtle negotiation with himself. Caleb waited. The drizzle turned to a fine mist, collecting on his eyelashes. Time stretched, marked only by the low rumble of tires overhead. Then, in a fluid, almost soundless motion, the Bobcat shifted forward, his body melting into the thin. Light like water flowing from shadow. He stopped short of the offering, crouched low, amber eyes never leaving Caleb's. It was not acceptance, not yet. It was a question. Will you stay your distance? Caleb slowly lowered himself to sit on the wet grass, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. He didn't reach out. He didn't move closer. He simply became a part of the landscape, breathing quietly as though he'd done this all his life. For 15 patient minutes, man and animal regarded each other, a bridge of stillness spanning the divide between their worlds. A distant horn startled Ash, and he retreated in one bound, disappearing into the darkness of the drain. Caleb let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't follow. Instead, he stood, brushing the wet from his jeans, and glanced at the untouched piece of chicken by the edge. He had a feeling it wouldn't remain there for long after he left. Driving home, Caleb's hands trembled slightly on the wheel, not from cold, but from the quiet electricity of connection. The first thread had been woven, delicate and easily broken, but real. Tomorrow he would return, not to force trust, but to honor it. The third evening arrived with a hush that felt like a held breath. The rain had lifted, leaving the world damp and reflective, every puddle a mirror for the soft orange glow of the streetlights. Caleb's old truck hummed down Highway 41, its headlights cutting thin beams through the mist rising from the cooling asphalt. He felt the now familiar tug in his chest as he approached the slope where the storm drain gaped. This was no longer an idle curiosity. It was a quiet pilgrimage. He parked on the shoulder, the gravel crunching beneath his tires in a rhythm that seemed to belong only to this secret ritual. Stepping out into the evening, Caleb inhaled deeply. The air carried the sharp scent of wet leaves and the faint musk of turned soil from nearby fields. Without the rain, every sound carried farther, the high whine of a distant motorcycle, the whisper of a breeze nudging the last brown leaves across the road, the faint trickle of water inside the drain. Crouching low near the storm drain, he didn't speak. He simply waited, his flashlight off, his body still. He'd learned that patience wasn't passive, it was a form of respect. He let his ears and eyes adjust to the dimness until the shadows revealed movement. There, two familiar amber points in the darkness. Ash emerged slowly, his body low, shoulders rippling under his mottled fur. The Bobcat's ears flicked, reading the air, and then his gaze locked with Caleb's. In that moment, the world narrowed to the width of the storm drain. Trucks roared past behind them, wind tugging at Caleb's jacket, but none of it mattered. It was as if the universe had bent itself into a thin corridor of trust. Caleb's heart thudded in his chest, not from fear, but from awe. He had seen animals in the wild. Before, deer in the mist, foxes slipping between trees. But this was different. This was not chance. This was recognition. He thought of Lydia then, of the mornings they'd knelt in the frosted woods, her gloved hand tightening gently on his when a fox had stared back at them. She had once whispered, "The wild knows when you see it for real." Slowly, carefully, Caleb reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a piece of cooked chicken. He set it on the grass a few feet from the drain, his movements unhurried, his eyes never leaving Ash's. He leaned back, giving the Bobcat the space to choose. Ash hesitated, his body tense, tail twitching once in a slow arc. His nose lifted, scenting the offering. Hunger spoke louder than fear now, but so did something more subtle, the thread of understanding forming between them. He stepped forward, one paw, then another, limping slightly on the injured pad. The dim light caught on the curve of his whiskers as he approached the food. Caleb didn't move. He only breathed, letting his presence settle like an anchor. Ash reached the offering and lowered his head, the faint sound of teeth meeting chicken breaking the soft night. But before eating, he paused, eyes lifting once more to meet Caleb's. In that silent exchange, something passed between them, a wordless acknowledgement that neither was truly alone. For the first time since Lydia's passing, Caleb felt a quiet warmth spread through the cold hollow of his chest. Not joy exactly, but something steadier, a sense of belonging, of being woven back into the fabric of the living world by a creature who owed him nothing. Ash finished the scrap and retreated a step, not in panic, but with measured dignity. He slipped into the shadows again, but the connection remained. Caleb stayed kneeling on the damp grass, the coolness seeping through his jeans, feeling as if he'd just been entrusted with a fragile secret. He rose slowly, glancing at the dark opening where the bobcat's eyes had vanished. For the first time in years, he whispered aloud, "Thank you." If you've ever shared a silent moment of trust with an animal, subscribe to join a community that cherishes those bonds. Tell me in the comments, what's the most unforgettable moment of connection you've experienced with a wild creature? The night after the bobcat accepted his offering, Caleb lay awake in his small bedroom, staring at the ceiling where the faint pattern of streetlight filtered through the curtains. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of settling wood. He should have felt satisfied with the moment he had earned. A wild animal had trusted him enough to take food in his presence. But instead, a restless worry threaded through his chest. He pictured Ash huddled in the damp storm drain, his ribs visible in the thin light, the subtle limp in his step when he'd emerged to eat. Hunger and injury were dangerous, companions for a bobcat in late autumn. Caleb's mind filled with quiet calculations. He knew that wild predators couldn't survive long on scraps from a human hand, and he also knew that interference could cause more harm than good. But he also remembered the slow, deliberate blink of those amber eyes, and how something in that silent exchange had pulled him out of the gravity of his own grief. In the morning, the decision began to take shape. He brewed coffee in the kitchen, the scent mingling with the earthy smell of the rain-soaked fields outside, and opened his old laptop. He searched local wildlife resources and rehabilitation guidelines, scrolling through articles lit by the pale dawn creeping through the window. Observe first. Intervene only if injury prevents survival, one guideline said. Another warned, human attachment can endanger release. Caleb read them all, weighing each line like a moral ledger. He couldn't shake the image of that injured paw pressing against the wet concrete. His hand stilled on the keyboard. If I walk away and he doesn't survive, will I carry that silence with me forever? By noon, he had made up his mind. He drove into town and stopped by the small wildlife center near the county line. The building smelled faintly of hay and disinfectant, and a soft chorus of birdsong came from the rehabilitation cages out back. A woman in a worn fleece vest introduced herself as Marlene, a wildlife officer. Her hair was tied back in a silver-streaked braid, and her eyes held the pragmatic calm of someone who'd seen both rescues and losses. Caleb told her everything, the storm drain, the limp, the food offerings. He admitted he hadn't approached closer than a few feet. Marlene nodded slowly, then leaned her hands on the counter. "You did the right thing by observing first," she said. "Bobcats are resilient, but that paw could get infected. If he's losing weight, he won't make the winter without help. We can advise on capture, but it'll take patience." "Patience," Caleb murmured, almost to himself. It felt like the word had followed him from the edge of that storm drain. Marlene gave him a small crate of supplies, a pair of heavy gloves, a container of nutrient-rich food for luring the animal, and instructions for contacting her once the bobcat was comfortable enough for a safe trap to be set. "He has to choose to trust you first," she said. "If we force it too soon, he might run into traffic or abandon the area entirely." That evening, Caleb parked on the familiar shoulder and crouched near the drain again. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and the faint metallic tang of cold water. He set out the food Marlene had given him, then settled in to wait. His breath clouded in the fading light and his muscles ached from the stillness, but he didn't move. Ash emerged cautiously, limping but steady, and locked eyes with him once more. Caleb felt the weight of his decision solidify. He would see this through, no matter how long it took, no matter the quiet cost of his time and worry. Saving this life felt like saving something in himself. The morning of the first intervention arrived shrouded in fog, the kind that blurs the horizon and muffles the world into a soft, expectant silence. Caleb pulled his truck onto the gravel shoulder, headlights dim in the mist, his breath clouding in the cold air as he stepped out. The storm drain loomed ahead, its mouth slick with moisture, the trickle of water inside echoing like a distant metronome. Today, he would try to help Ash, not just feed him, not just watch, but take the first real step toward rescue. Marlene's instructions replayed in his mind as he crouched at the edge of the embankment. He'd brought the humane trap, baited with fresh chicken and a piece of venison she'd provided. He had coated it lightly with damp leaves and mud to disguise the human scent, as she had advised. The metal glinted faintly in the gray light, the door rigged to close softly. It was a risk. Too soon, and the fragile trust might shatter. Too late, and the injury or hunger could claim him. Caleb placed the trap just beyond the lip of the drain where the slope met the flat ground, near where he'd left food before. He retreated 10 paces and settled into the wet grass, letting the cold seep into his jeans. He became part of the landscape again, silent, patient, a fixture of this quiet ritual. The highway above murmured with sparse morning traffic, the hum of tires carrying a muted warning to the wild heart below. Minutes passed, then a shadow shifted in the darkness. Ash emerged slowly, his coat mottled with mist, his ears flicking forward as he scented the air. His limp was more noticeable in the daylight, each step careful against the cold, damp concrete. He paused when his nose caught the aroma of meat, his amber eyes narrowing as he scanned the slope. Caleb didn't move, though his heart thudded with the steady pressure of hope and fear. The bobcat crept toward the offering, his belly low, his tail a cautious pendulum. He sniffed the edge of the trap, whiskers quivering, and stepped inside with one paw. Caleb held his breath. Another step. The door shivered as his hind paw brushed the trigger plate. A truck roared over the highway, sending a deep vibration down through the concrete. Ash jerked in instinctive panic. The metal frame rattled. In a flash of tawny fur and coiled muscle, he spun and bolted back into the drain, vanishing into shadow as the trapdoor clanged harmlessly against the side. Caleb exhaled shakily, his hands trembling against his knees. The failure stung more than he expected. He had known the first attempt might fail, but witnessing the fear ripple through the animal's body left a hollow ache in his chest. He retrieved the trap, careful not to disturb the area too much, and reset the bait with deliberate calm. The rest of the morning he waited, letting the fog thin into pale daylight. Ash did not emerge again. Caleb imagined him crouched deep in the dark, heart racing, amber eyes wide with suspicion. The fragile thread between them had stretched to its limit, and Caleb could only hope it hadn't snapped entirely. Driving home, his mind churned with a mix of determination and doubt. Was he helping or simply intruding? He recalled Marlene's warning. He has to choose to trust you first. That trust had faltered today, but Caleb understood now that the bond they were building would not be forged in one leap. It would take time, and he would give it. That night he sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, listening to the rain return. Outside, somewhere in the dark hollow of a storm drain, a bobcat waited. And Caleb knew he would be there again tomorrow, ready to try, ready to keep that quiet promise they'd made, in silence. The day Caleb finally succeeded began without ceremony. A brittle frost coated the grass along the embankment, crunching softly beneath his boots as he approached the storm drain at first light. A low mist hovered above the ground, curling in pale tendrils as if reluctant to leave the earth. Caleb carried the trap again, baited with the rich scent of venison and chicken, its metal chilled from the night air. He knelt by the drain, his breath forming ghosts in the cold. This time he moved with the patience of a man who had learned that haste meant nothing to a wild heart. He placed the trap in the same spot as before, camouflaged with leaves and a dusting of dirt. Then he retreated, sinking onto the frost-stiffened grass, and became as still as the trees lining the road. The sun had barely risen, turning the fog a soft peach color, and the only sounds were the occasional drip of water from the storm drain and the distant rumble of a farm truck heading out for the day. Minutes stretched like hours. Caleb's fingers numbed against the cold, but he did not move. Then, from the shadows, Ash emerged. His coat looked duller than before, and the limp in his step was pronounced, but his movements held the same quiet dignity. He sniffed the air, pausing at the edge of light, his amber eyes scanning for threat. Hunger, once again, became stronger than fear. He approached the trap slowly, each step a careful decision. Caleb's pulse quickened when Ash placed his first paw on the trigger plate. A long pause followed. Then another step. The door swung shut with a muted clink, and for the first time, Ash was contained. The bobcat reacted in a whirl of muscle and instinct, pressing against the sides of the trap, teeth bared in silent defiance. Caleb felt his own chest tighten, his instinct to open the door battling the knowledge that this was the only way to save him. He knelt near the trap, speaking softly in the chilled morning air. "It's all right. I see you. You're safe." The words were not for meaning, but for presence. Slowly, Ash stilled, crouching low, ears flat, but no longer thrashing. His wild eyes met Caleb's, and in them was no betrayal, only confusion, fear, and the flicker of enduring strength. The drive to the small wildlife center was silent but charged. The crate sat in the truck bed, strapped securely, the cold wind carrying the scents of pine and distant smoke. Marlene met him at the back entrance, her gloved hands steady as she guided the trap into a warm, hay-scented recovery pen. The room hummed with quiet life, chirps from convalescing birds, the rustle of a raccoon in another enclosure. Examining Ash's paw, Marlene noted the slice had deepened, but not infected yet. She cleaned it gently, applied a small bandage, and administered fluids and antibiotics while Caleb sat nearby, his presence a silent anchor. Ash flinched, but endured, his ears twitching at every soft clink of metal and rustle of hay. Over the next 2 weeks, Caleb visited daily. He arrived with fresh water, watched feedings, and sometimes just sat on the edge of the pen while Ash rested in the straw. The bobcat's recovery was not linear. One day he would pace the pen with quiet irritation. The next he would curl in a corner, eyes half closed. But slowly the limp eased, his coat regained a faint sheen, and the wary tension in his body softened to alert curiosity. Each visit reshaped something in Caleb, too. He found himself speaking more, small, murmured observations, memories of Lydia, even confessions he hadn't voiced to anyone else. "You're tougher than I am," he whispered one afternoon, watching Ash lick his paw under a heat lamp. For the first time in 3 years, the silence he carried didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like companionship. When Marlene finally said, "He's almost ready," a quiet pride bloomed in Caleb's chest. This was not the loud triumph of heroism. It was the patient satisfaction of a promise kept, a life safeguarded through quiet persistence. Both man and animal had begun to heal, one paw, one heartbeat, one shared moment at a time. Early spring arrived almost without Caleb noticing. One morning he drove to the wildlife center and realized the fields along Highway 41 were tinged with green again, the frosted earth now soft under the gentle warmth of the sun. His truck windows were cracked to let in the smell of thawing soil and last night's rain. It struck him how different the world looked when your eyes were open to it, when you weren't just passing through in a haze of grief. Inside the rehabilitation barn, sunlight slanted through high windows, catching dust motes and golden beams. Caleb leaned on the edge of Ash's pen, the scent of clean hay and faint antiseptic mingling in the air. The bobcat was standing now, strong and balanced, his fur glossy again, his paw fully healed beneath a faint scar. His body moved with the coiled ease of the wild, every shift purposeful, every pause full of awareness. Ash lifted his head when Caleb approached, amber eyes meeting his with the steady calm of recognition. He no longer flinched at the sound of boots on the concrete or the creak of the wooden gate. He watched, alert but unafraid, as Caleb knelt by the pen. In those eyes, Caleb saw the reflection of all the quiet hours spent waiting in the cold, the soft words spoken into a silence that had once felt unbearable. He realized this bond had changed them both. Caleb had begun to change in other ways, too. He no longer came home to a house that felt like a sealed tomb. He'd cleared the dust from Lydia's old camera and taken it on short walks by the river, capturing the bloom of frost-melted moss and the flight of a heron lifting from the shallows. His neighbors noticed him lingering by the fence lines, greeting them with nods instead of hurried silence. Even the auto shop felt different, its greasy routine interrupted by moments where he caught himself humming along with the radio. One afternoon, Marlene approached as Caleb lingered near the pen. "He's ready," she said simply. "He's got his weight back, the paw's strong, and he's restless. That's a good sign." Caleb nodded, his throat tight with a complicated mix of pride and ache. He had known this day would come. All the waiting, the patience, the silent prayers whispered into the chill air. It had always led here. Ash was not his to keep. He belonged to the wind that rippled over the fields, to the brush and the shadows and the song of crickets at night. When the barn grew quiet again, Caleb stayed a while longer. Ash stretched in the pen, then settled, curling his tail around his paws in a gesture that had become familiar. Caleb crouched, speaking softly even if the words weren't needed. "You saved me too, you know," he murmured, voice catching slightly. I think I needed to remember what it felt like to care about something living." The bobcat blinked slowly, that deliberate, almost human gesture of calm acknowledgement, and in that moment Caleb felt something loosen deep in his chest, a weight he'd been carrying since the day the house went quiet. As the sun shifted and the barn filled with warm light, he realized this journey had not just been about rescue. It had been about rejoining the world after hiding in his own storm drain of grief. Ash had emerged from darkness, and in some way, so had he. If you believe that connection can transform lives in silence, subscribe now to join a community that cherishes these bonds. Tell me in the comments, has an animal ever helped you heal in a way words never could? The morning of the release arrived clear and tender, the kind of spring day that seemed to hum with new beginnings. A pale mist drifted over the meadow beyond the tree line, and the soft chorus of early birdsong wove through the air. Caleb parked his old truck at the edge of a narrow gravel road and cut the engine. For a moment, he simply sat with his hands on the wheel, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine and the muffled heartbeat in his chest. In the truck bed, the crate sat covered by a tarp to keep Ash calm. Inside, the bobcat shifted lightly, his movements contained but strong, a quiet reminder of the wild power that would soon return to its rightful place. Caleb stepped out, his boots sinking into the dew-soaked grass. The scent of damp earth and the faint sweetness of budding wildflowers wrapped around him. He and Marlene carried the crate to the edge of the clearing where the forest began, each step careful, as if they were bearing something sacred. Sunlight filtered through the bare branches, just starting to sprout tender green, casting dappled patterns across the ground. Caleb's breath fogged lightly in the cool air as he knelt beside the crate, his hand resting for a heartbeat on the metal frame. "Take your time, boy," he whispered, his voice steady but soft. Marlene unlatched the door. For a moment, Ash did not move. He crouched low, his body a coil of tension and curiosity, nose twitching as the sense of his true home rushed in. The forest smelled alive, rich soil, damp leaves, the faint musk of distant rabbits. He blinked once, twice, and then stepped forward. The bobcat emerged with a grace that belonged only to the wild. Sunlight caught the sheen of his fur as he slipped into the grass, his body low but certain. He paused a few feet from the crate, ears swiveling, taking in the familiar language of the earth beneath his paws. Then, with a slow turn of his head, he looked back. Amber eyes met Caleb's one final time. In that silent moment, words were unnecessary. Caleb felt a swell in his chest, a mixture of pride, ache, and gratitude. He had done what he set out to do, not to own, not to tame, but to witness and to honor. Their story had always been one of presence, of seeing and being seen in the quiet spaces life often overlooks. Ash blinked slowly, a deliberate gesture of calm, before slipping into the undergrowth. His tail vanished last, a brush of tawny fur swallowed by the green shadows. The forest held him now, as it always should have. Caleb stayed kneeling long after the bobcat disappeared. He listened to the wind whisper through the new leaves, the distant call of a mourning dove, the soft drip of water from last night's dew. The world felt wider than it had in years. Driving home, he noticed things he hadn't before, the shimmer of sunlight on the river, the soft tremor of wildflowers in the breeze, the way a red-tailed hawk wheeled against the blue sky. The storm drain was empty now, but in some way, so was the hollow place he had carried inside himself. He thought of Lydia and smiled, knowing she would have understood. Life would go on in its quiet rhythm, cars speeding over the highway, storms filling the drains again. But Caleb would never forget the amber eyes in the shadows, or the unspoken promise they had shared. Sometimes, he realized, love doesn't need to be loud to be real. Sometimes simply being there, truly seeing, truly staying, is enough to change everything.